So it's wonderful to see so many of you here in the library this morning. My name's Julie and I've been organising the talk with Jean today. You may be aware our event today is part of the United Nations and Global Initiative, which is 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. And the 16 days started yesterday. I'd like to introduce Jean Calder, who's been a campaigner for women's rights for many years. Jean and her fellow campaigners are committed to raising awareness of women who have fought and in some cases died to promote women's rights, including the right to vote. And Mary Clarke, who Jean's going to be speaking about, is one of these women. Jean and her colleagues launched the Mary Clarke Statue appeal on the 18th of November 2018 to commemorate women who were attacked on Black Friday. We are collecting donations for the Mary Clarke Statue appeal today, so if you're able to, you'll see that there is a green collection pot here. And we'd be grateful for any donations, of course. So without further ado, I shall hand you over to Jean. Thank you very much.
So first of all, it's brilliant to see so many people here. I mean, I was thinking there'd be about 5 people. So it's absolutely fantastic and lovely to see you in your orange ribbons. River, who's one of our child ambassadors, in fact our first child ambassador, took ribbons around, and there are some here for people who want them. I heard her explaining to everybody what it's about, because this UN campaign which is an annual campaign against violence against women, which started on the 25th and goes on for the 16 days, the colour that the UN have chosen is orange, and they have this rather naff slogan, which is Orange the World, and it's something that we actually don't follow very well in this country, so it seemed a good idea to actually do that. So that's the first thing. I mean, somebody asked me the other day why we in the Mary Clarke Statue appeal wanted to have a statue to this woman who basically is totally unknown. Until very recently, nobody knew anything but pretty much about her. And certainly she'd been well and truly forgotten in Brighton. And, you know, the answer to that I gave was that at a national level, she's significant because she was the first suffragette to die for the right to vote, well in advance of Emily Davison, who died in 1913 under the King's horse. So she has that national significance. But also she seemed particularly, you know, she had actually had a huge significance in Brighton and the South East during 1909 to 1910 and building the Women's Social and Political Union down here. And yet that history had been completely forgotten. She had been so comprehensively forgotten that even her own family had forgotten her. And given that she was Emmeline Pankhurst's younger sister, that is quite extraordinary. And you know, that this is a family, the history of which is very well known. And yet we know, unfortunately she's not here, Bryony Goulden is one of our trustees, and she's a great, great niece of Mary Clarke. And she grew up, she would say, remembering that she had these illustrious relations, forebears, who were the Pankhursts, and knew nothing. She knew there was an Auntie Mary somewhere, but knew nothing about her, and which is extraordinary. And she came to live in Brighton and still didn't know, and so it was a real revelation to her to find out about this fantastic history. And the more we found out, the more wonderful she seems as a person, but also she seemed to have huge significance. I mean, in a way, it was almost a good thing to have a statue to somebody who had been forgotten. We've called this the forgotten sister because literally she is obviously Emmeline's sister, but she seems to stand for so many forgotten sisters, because women's history has been forgotten very often, and we know that in 2018 when we set up a number of women, some of whom are here in this audience, were involved in a campaign to try and get blue plaques for women, particularly the suffragette movement, because that was the centenary of the first women getting the vote in 2018. And at that time there was a campaign, if you recall, to get a statue nationally, and the big statue of Millicent Fawcett was put up in Parliament Square as part of those celebrations. And so people around the country were starting to think about the fact, looking at their cities and thinking, well, hang on, we haven't got anything here. And I mean, here in Brighton and Hove, we had 2 statues of Queen Victoria, but apart from that, we'd had sort of Max Miller more recently, we'd had Steve Ovett, but you know, apart from the royal statue of George IV, isn't it? There really hadn't been anything. And you know, I discovered Mary Clarke quite by accident in a footnote in somebody's history, and that seemed, you know, the more I found out about her, the fact that she was the first to die, that she was Emmeline Pankhurst's sister, but also she was a survivor of domestic abuse, that she had had this abusive relationship, that she had been somebody who was really a late developer. Nothing came easily to Mary, and she had this sort of late flowering, which then was tragically cut short. So that's really the reason why we feel so passionately that we should have something for her. Partly because this is a city of sanctuary, and there are lots of people who've experienced suffering. There are huge numbers of women, as we know, who've experienced sexual and domestic violence, and for them she will be a symbol as well. So that's the general background. Now, just to tell you a little bit about Mary herself. I mean, she was born in Manchester, brought up. She was in a comfortably off family, but interestingly, her father and mother, both of whom were incredibly talented people, they came from a humble background. I mean, her father had made money, he'd pulled himself up by his bootstraps, he'd become a businessman, he'd worked in the cotton industry. And had made money, and you know, made sure his children were educated, but they had no inherited money, and the girls were not educated as the boys were educated. And Mary was always in the shadow of Emmeline. Emmeline was this astonishingly precocious child. You know, she could read at 3. She was very beautiful, incredibly charismatic, always spoke very well. And so Mary was she was the little sister, she was the support. And when Emmeline married Richard Pankhurst, so she married up in class terms. She married a professional man who had a political career, was very well known, although they had very little money. She supported Richard's politics. She was a member of the the Independent Labour Party, and she was always in the supportive role. When they married and had children, she was there looking after the children. Even when Emmeline worked as a registrar, if she had to go off doing political things, Mary would step in and actually do her job for her. So for years she was in this supportive role, being the beloved Auntie Mary. And her own life really seems to have been pretty much put on hold. She was artistic, she was known to be artistic. At one stage she wanted to be an actress, but her family wouldn't have it. It really was only when she was approaching 30 that she left the family home. But when Emmeline and her husband went back from London to Manchester, and she was left. Nobody knows exactly what happened at that point, but she married late, and she married a man called Jean Calder, and it was a very unfortunate marriage, unlike Emmeline's, which was a very there was a love match, but it was a very intelligent marriage on her part. Mary's did her real damage, because he was an abusive man, and for the next 8 years or so, it seems as if she suffered very badly. We know at least 2 occasions when she tried to get away from him, and eventually succeeding around 1905, that kind of time. She'd, I think, probably always supported the suffrage, commitments of her sister, but it really was only after that time. So in the really the last 5 years of her life that she really sort of came into her own. And it was an extraordinary thing. I mean, thinking it's difficult enough for somebody who's experienced domestic violence or abuse to get away from a situation now, then virtually impossible, no refuges, no capacity to divorce her husband, but she managed to get away. And then after that, she devoted her life to women's rights, basically. In 1906, she was actually, I mean, the Women's Social and Political Union was set up in 1903 by Emmeline Pankhurst and the others. But in 1906, it went national. And that meeting to set it up as a national body, Mary was there, and Mary is named as one of the committee who agreed that. And there's seems to have been a gradual progression where she moved from sort of being a foot soldier to actually more of a leadership role.